The sun was setting over the hills of Virginia, painting the sky in warm hues that reflected off the windows of the old farmhouse. David, a tall 28-year-old with expressive eyes, pulled his car to a stop in front of the main house. He exhaled deeply, feeling how the peace of the countryside contrasted with the hectic life he led in New York City. As he got out of the vehicle, his eyes scanned the facade of the house. Every crack, every board weathered by time, told a story. His story. That of his grandfather Clarence. The story of a family forged not by blood but by love and resilience. "David, my boy," Clarence's warm, gravelly voice echoed from the porch. The old man, seated in his wheelchair, smiled broadly. At 85, his face showed the marks of time and hard work, but his eyes shone with an unbreakable vitality. David ran to his grandfather, bending down to hug him. "Grandpa, I've missed you so much." As they entered the house, memories flooded David's mind. Flashbacks of his childhood intermingled with the present. He ran through the farm fields chasing butterflies. He helped his grandfather feed the animals. He listened intently to Clarence's stories about Africa and his arrival in America. That night, sitting on the porch under a starry sky, Clarence once again shared the story of his life. "You know, David, I'll never forget the day I arrived in this country. I was just a scared child, torn from my homeland. But that family, they took me in as if I were their own son." David listened, fascinated as always. "What was America like back then, Grandpa?" "Different, my boy. Very different. But this farm, it's been my home ever since. Here I grew up. Here I met your grandmother. Here we raised your mother." Clarence's voice broke slightly at the mention of his late wife. As they talked, David noticed something that troubled him. A bruise peeked out from under Clarence's shirt sleeve. "Grandpa, what happened to your arm?" Clarence looked at the bruise indifferently. "Oh, it's nothing, David. At my age, you bump into things easily. Last week, I fell out of my chair. You know how stubborn I am. I wanted to reach a book without asking for help." David frowned, concerned. "You have to be more careful, Grandpa. Promise me you'll ask for help next time." Clarence nodded, but there was something in his gaze that David couldn't decipher. Was it fear? Shame? Before he could inquire further, Clarence changed the subject. "And what about you, my grandson? How's life in the big city?" David smiled, but the concern didn't leave his eyes. As he talked about his work as a lawyer in New York, he couldn't help but think about the bruise. Something didn't add up in his grandfather's explanation. That night, lying in his old room, David couldn't sleep. The ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed to mark the beginning of something. Something that would change their lives forever. With moonlight filtering through the window, David made a decision. He would extend his stay on the farm. He needed to make sure his grandfather was okay. What David didn't know was that this decision would lead him to unravel long-buried family secrets and to face challenges that would test his love and loyalty like never before. Dawn arrived at the farm, bringing with it a mist that clung to the fields like a ghostly veil. David woke up early, determined to spend more time with his grandfather and unravel the mystery of the bruises. As he helped Clarence with his morning tasks, David noticed a change in the atmosphere. The usual tranquility of the farm seemed disturbed by an underlying tension he couldn't quite understand. "Grandpa, is everything okay with the farm?" David asked as he pushed Clarence's wheelchair through the garden. Clarence sighed, his gaze lost on the horizon. "Things aren't as easy as they used to be, my boy. Times change and this old farm struggles to stay afloat." Before David could inquire further, the sound of an approaching car caught his attention. A luxurious vehicle stopped in front of the house, and a man in his 60s got out, dressed in an expensive suit that contrasted with the rural surroundings. "Uncle Anthony," David muttered, surprised. It had been years since he'd seen his uncle, Clarence's adoptive brother who had distanced himself from the family long ago. Clarence visibly tensed in his chair. "Anthony, what a surprise to see you here." Anthony approached, his face a mask of cordiality that didn't reach his eyes. "Clarence, brother, I came to see how you were doing." His gaze shifted to David. "Ah, David. I didn't expect to see you here." The encounter was uncomfortable, charged with a tension that David didn't fully understand. As the three sat on the porch, memories of the past began to surface. David remembered fragments of conversations overheard in his childhood, heated arguments between Clarence and Anthony, flashbacks of tense moments during family gatherings, barely disguised looks of contempt from Anthony towards Clarence. "How are things in the city, Anthony?" Clarence asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Prosperous, as always," Anthony replied with a hint of arrogance. "By the way, I've been thinking about our pending matter. Have you reconsidered my offer?" Clarence shook his head. "I've told you, Anthony. This farm is not for sale. It's my home, my life." David observed the exchange with growing concern. Offer? Sale? What was going on? Anthony stood up, his face hardening. "Think about it carefully, Clarence. You can't keep this place forever. It's too big a burden for you." When Anthony left, the silence that remained was deafening. David looked at his grandfather, noticing the fatigue on his face. "Grandpa, what was all that about? What offer?" Clarence closed his eyes for a moment. "Anthony wants to buy the farm. He says it's for the best, that I can't manage it in my condition. But this land, it's more than property, David. It's the legacy of the family that took me in, that gave me a home when I had nothing." That night, as David helped Clarence prepare for bed, he noticed more bruises on his back. His heart skipped a beat. "Grandpa, these bruises, are you sure they're just from falls?" Clarence's gaze darkened. "Sometimes, my boy. It's better not to ask certain questions." David stayed awake late into the night, his mind racing. Anthony's visits, the unexplained bruises, the tension in the air. It all pointed to something sinister happening beneath the farm's tranquil surface. Making a decision, David took out his phone and dialed a number. "Hello, it's David. I need you to send me a security camera." "Yes, one that can be easily hidden. It's urgent." As he waited for the call to connect, David looked out the window into the darkness enveloping the farm. He was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The package arrived 2 days later, hidden in a box of farm supplies. David received it with a mixture of anticipation and fear. The small security camera, no bigger than a button, weighed heavily in his hand. That night, while Clarence slept, David crept silently into his grandfather's room. With trembling hands, he installed the camera in a discreet corner, making sure it had a clear view of the entire room. Every creak of the wooden floor made his heart race, fearing he would wake Clarence and have to explain his actions. The following days passed in silent tension. David divided his time between helping on the farm and obsessively reviewing the recordings on his laptop. Life on the property seemed to follow its normal course. Clarence supervising the workers from his wheelchair, shared meals at the big kitchen table, quiet afternoons on the porch. However, the apparent calm was interrupted by Anthony's increasingly frequent visits. Every time the luxurious car appeared in the driveway, David felt the air grow heavier. One afternoon, while reviewing the recordings, David noticed something that chilled his blood. On the screen, he saw Anthony enter Clarence's room in the middle of the night. The conversation that followed was in whispers, but the body language was clear. Anthony, threatening, leaning over Clarence's bed, who visibly shrank back. "Sign the papers, you stubborn old man." Anthony's voice was barely audible. "You can't protect this place forever." Clarence's response was firm despite the tremor in his voice. "Never. This land is my home, my legacy." The sound of a slap resonated in David's headphones, followed by his grandfather's muffled groan. David slammed the laptop shut, feeling nauseous. The truth he had so feared to confirm was now before his eyes, raw and painful. That night, during dinner, David observed his grandfather with new eyes. Every cautious movement, every disguised wince of pain, everything took on a new and terrible meaning. "Grandpa," David began, his voice trembling, "I need you to be honest with me. What's really going on with Uncle Anthony?" Clarence looked up from his plate, his eyes full of a mixture of fear and resignation. "Ah, my boy," he sighed. "There are things from the past that are better left buried." "But he's hurting you," David insisted. "I saw the bruises. I know they're not accidents." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Clarence spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "The farm, it's in trouble, David. Debts that have accumulated over the years. Anthony wants to buy it, says it's the only way to save it. But I know the truth. He just wants to destroy the last thing left of the family that adopted us, that gave me a home." David felt his world crumbling. "Why didn't you tell me before? We could have looked for a solution together." "I didn't want to be a burden," Clarence replied, tears shining in his eyes. "This farm is all I have, all I am. If I lose it—" At that moment, the sound of an approaching car interrupted the conversation. David looked out the window and saw Anthony's now familiar vehicle. "Go to your room, Grandpa," David said, a fierce determination taking over him. "I'll handle this." As Clarence retreated, David prepared to confront his uncle. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, revealing a dark picture of greed and cruelty. But David was determined. He wouldn't allow anyone, not even a family member, to hurt his grandfather or take away his home. With his heart pounding strongly, David opened the door, ready to face Anthony and the shadows of the past that threatened to destroy everything he loved. The door burst open, and Anthony entered like a storm, his face contorted in a sneer. He stopped short when he saw David standing in the hallway, arms crossed and defiant gaze. "Where's Clarence?" Anthony demanded, ignoring any greetings. David took a step forward, his voice firm. "Uncle Anthony, we need to talk." The tension in the air was palpable as the two men stared at each other. Anthony was the first to break the silence, his tone condescending. "There's nothing to talk about, boy. This is between your grandfather and me." "You're wrong," David replied, his voice trembling slightly with contained rage. "I know what you've been doing. The beatings, the threats, it's over." Anthony's face darkened. "You have no idea what you're talking about. This matter doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when you're hurting my grandfather," David retorted, taking out his phone. "I have evidence, Uncle. Recordings of your nighttime visits, of your threats." For a moment, Anthony seemed disconcerted, but he quickly regained his composure. His voice lowered to a threatening whisper. "Listen to me carefully, David. You don't know what you're getting into. This farm is drowning in debt. Clarence is too stubborn to see that my offer is his only way out." David didn't back down. "And that justifies the abuse, the threats. What kind of man are you?" "I'm a businessman," Anthony spat. "And I'll do whatever it takes to get what I want. If you know what's good for you, you'll stay out of it." At that moment, the sound of wheels on wood drew both their attention. Clarence appeared in the hallway, his face a mask of determination. "That's enough, Anthony," Clarence said, his voice laden with an authority David had rarely heard. "You've gone too far." Anthony turned to Clarence, his facade of civility completely abandoned. "You," he roared, "you're the one to blame for all this. If you had signed the papers when I asked you to—" "Never," Clarence interrupted. "This land is my home, my legacy. The family that adopted us trusted me to take care of it. I won't abandon it, no matter the consequences." David stepped between his grandfather and Anthony. "It's over, Uncle. I have all the evidence I need. If you don't leave right now, I'll call the police." For a moment, it seemed like Anthony was going to attack, his fists clenched, his body tense like a spring. But something in David's determined gaze made him hesitate. "This isn't over," Anthony growled, backing towards the door. "Watch your back, David, and you, Clarence, remember my words. This farm will be mine, one way or another." With those words, Anthony left, the door slam echoing throughout the house. The silence that followed was broken by Clarence's choked sob. David knelt beside his grandfather's wheelchair, taking his trembling hands. "Grandpa, why didn't you tell me before? We could have sought help." Clarence shook his head, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I was afraid, my boy. Afraid of losing everything, of being a burden to you. This farm, it's all I have." David hugged his grandfather, feeling the weight of the truth on his shoulders. "You're not alone in this, Grandpa. We'll find a solution, I promise you." That night, as Clarence slept, David sat on the porch, looking at the stars. The magnitude of the situation overwhelmed him. Anthony's threats resonated in his mind, mixing with his concerns about the farm's debts and his grandfather's safety. With determination, he took out his phone and dialed a number. "Hello, this is David Oliver. I need to speak with someone from the police. It's about a case of elder abuse and extortion." As he waited to be connected, David looked towards the house. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to protect his grandfather and the farm's legacy, no matter the cost. Dawn arrived with a mixture of hope and anxiety. David, who had barely slept, was in the kitchen preparing coffee when he heard the familiar creak of Clarence's wheelchair. "Good morning, Grandpa," David greeted, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling?" Clarence looked at him with tired but determined eyes. "Like a man who has carried a secret for too long, my boy, but also like someone who can finally see a ray of light." David sat across from his grandfather, his hands wrapping around a cup of hot coffee. "Grandpa, last night, I made a call to the police." The silence that followed was tense, broken only by the singing of birds outside the window. Finally, Clarence nodded slowly. "I understand. I suppose it was inevitable. They'll be coming today," David continued. "They'll need your testimony to see the evidence. Are you ready for this?" Before Clarence could respond, the sound of an approaching car alerted everyone on the farm. David went out to the porch, his heart pounding. An unfamiliar vehicle stopped, and two people got out. A man and a woman in police uniforms. The next few minutes passed in a blur. The officers introduced themselves as Sergeant Robert Thompson and Officer Emily Parker. "Mr. Oliver, Mr. Clarence," Sergeant Thompson began, his voice professional but kind. "We understand you're going through a difficult situation. We're here to help." Over the next few hours, David and Clarence recounted everything. Anthony's visits, the threats, the physical abuse. David showed the recordings from the hidden camera, and Clarence, with tears in his eyes, revealed the bruises he had been hiding. Officer Parker took detailed notes, her face a mask of professionalism, although David could notice the spark of indignation in her eyes. "This is sufficient evidence to start a formal investigation," said Sergeant Thompson. "Mr. Clarence, are you willing to press charges against your adoptive brother?" Clarence closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the decision visible in every line of his face. When he opened them, there was an iron determination in his gaze. "Yes," he responded, "for the sake of this farm, for the legacy of the family that took me in, and for my own well-being. Yes, I will press charges." Just as the officers were preparing to leave, promising to keep them informed about the progress of the investigation, the roar of a familiar engine filled the air. Anthony's car appeared in the driveway. "Stay inside," ordered Sergeant Thompson as he and Officer Parker went out to confront the newcomer. From the window, David and Clarence observed the scene unfolding in the yard. Anthony, visibly surprised by the police presence, was gesticulating furiously. His voice, though muffled by the walls, came in bursts of anger. "This is a family matter," he was heard shouting. "You have no right to interfere." Sergeant Thompson stood firm. "Mr. Anthony, we have evidence of abuse and extortion. I suggest you leave right now. You'll be receiving a summons soon." For a moment it seemed like Anthony was going to defy the officers, but then, casting a final venomous look towards the house, he got into his car and left, the wheels screeching on the gravel. When the police returned inside, Sergeant Thompson addressed David and Clarence. "We're going to increase patrols in this area. If Anthony or anyone else bothers you, call us immediately." After the officers left, David and Clarence sat on the porch, the silence between them laden with mixed emotions. "Did we do the right thing, Grandpa?" David asked, doubt coloring his voice. Clarence took his grandson's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Yes, my boy. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe freely. But the road ahead of us won't be easy." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in oranges and pinks, David looked out over the farm fields. The legal battle was just beginning, and he knew Anthony wouldn't give up without a fight. But for now, in this moment of calm, he allowed himself to feel a ray of hope. "Together, Grandpa," David said, squeezing Clarence's hand. "We'll face whatever comes. Together." The days following the police visit passed in a state of tense calm. David, determined to protect his grandfather and the farm, began to investigate more deeply into his family's history and the property's finances. One morning, while reviewing old documents in the dusty attic of the house, David found a worn box with his grandmother's name on it. With trembling hands he opened it, revealing a treasure trove of letters, photographs, and old documents. Among the yellowed papers, a sealed envelope caught his attention. It was addressed to Clarence in his grandmother's shaky handwriting. David hurried down the stairs, his heart pounding. "Grandpa," he called. entering the room where Clarence was reading by the window. "I found something I think you should see." Clarence took the envelope with curiosity. As he opened it and began to read, his eyes filled with tears. "It's from your grandmother," he whispered, "written shortly before she died." The letter revealed long-kept secrets. David's grandmother had discovered, years ago, documents proving that Clarence's adoption had been completely legal and binding. Moreover, Clarence's adoptive parents had left clear instructions in their will. The farm was to remain in Clarence's hands and those of his descendants. "This changes everything," David murmured, his mind racing. "Grandpa, do you understand what this means? Anthony has no legal right to this land." Clarence seemed stunned. "But why did your grandmother never tell me?" David continued reading the letter. "It says here that she feared Anthony's reaction. She knew how much he resented you, how much he desired the farm for himself. She thought keeping it a secret would protect you." At that moment, the phone rang, startling them both. It was Officer Parker. "Mr. Oliver," she said, her voice tense, "we have news. Anthony has been seen in town, meeting with some suspicious-looking men. We believe he might be planning something. We recommend extreme caution." David thanked her for the information and hung up, his mind racing. "Grandpa, I think we should ask for help. We can't face this alone." That afternoon, David began contacting neighbors and friends in the community. To his surprise and relief, many responded with offers of support. John, the owner of the local store, promised to keep a watchful eye out for any suspicious activity. Mary, a retired nurse who lived nearby, offered to stay at the house to help take care of Clarence. As the support network grew, David realized how deeply Clarence had touched the lives of those around him. The farm wasn't just a piece of land, it was the heart of a community. That night, sitting on the porch under a starry sky, David and Clarence talked at length about the past, the present, and the future. "I never fully understood Anthony's hatred," Clarence said, his voice laden with sadness. "We grew up together, but he always looked at me as an intruder." David took his grandfather's hand. "His hatred comes from fear and ignorance, Grandpa. But you've built something beautiful here. You've created a family that goes beyond blood." At that moment, the sound of several vehicles approaching broke the stillness of the night. Headlights illuminated the driveway. David jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. "Grandpa, stay here. I'm going to see what's going on." As David advanced towards the front of the house, he saw with horror that several men, led by Anthony, were getting out of the vehicles. The tension in the air was palpable. "Clarence!" Anthony shouted, his voice echoing in the night. "Come out and face me once and for all." David planted himself firmly on the porch, his defiant eyes fixed on his uncle. "This is over, Uncle Anthony. We have proof that the farm legally belongs to my grandfather. You have no rights here." Anthony let out a bitter laugh. "Proof? Don't make me laugh, boy. This land should have been mine from the beginning. That stubborn old man doesn't deserve any of this." Just as the situation seemed about to erupt into violence, the sound of police sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights illuminated the scene, and several patrol cars appeared on the road. Sergeant Thompson emerged from the first vehicle, his voice firm and authoritative. "Anthony Oliver, you're under arrest for attempted property invasion, threats, and elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent." As the police handcuffed Anthony and his accomplices, David felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The immediate danger had passed, but the emotional cost of this family battle was immense. Returning to the porch, he found Clarence watching the scene with tears in his eyes. "It's over, Grandpa," David said softly. "We're safe now." Clarence nodded slowly. "Yes, my boy, but the real work is just beginning. We have a farm to heal and a family to rebuild." As the night progressed and the police took Anthony away, David and Clarence remained together on the porch, their hearts heavy but full of hope for the future that awaited them. The months following Anthony's arrest passed in a whirlwind of activity. The farm, which had once been on the brink of collapse, began to revive under David's dedicated care and Clarence's wisdom. The community, moved by the family's story, came together to help, offering labor, resources, and emotional support. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courthouse in the small town was packed, the tension palpable in the air. David helped Clarence enter, noticing how his grandfather sat up straight in his wheelchair. his face a mask of determination. When Anthony entered, escorted by guards, silence fell over the room. For a moment, the eyes of the adoptive brothers met, decades of resentment, pain, and secrets reflected in that gaze. The trial began, and one by one, the witnesses were called. Neighbors, farm workers, even old family friends came forward to testify about Clarence's character and Anthony's actions. When it was Clarence's turn to testify, the room held its breath. In a clear and firm voice, Clarence spoke not only of the recent abuses, but of a lifetime of rejection and resentment. "I always tried to be a good brother to Anthony," Clarence said, his voice laden with emotion. "But for him, I was always the intruder, the one who stole his parents' love. He never understood that there was enough love for both of us." Anthony, sitting in the defendant's box, kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his face an impenetrable mask. When it was David's turn to testify, he spoke passionately about the love and wisdom his grandfather had taught him, and how the farm was much more than property. It was the heart of a family and a community. "My uncle Anthony didn't just try to steal land," David concluded, his voice resonating in the room. "He tried to destroy a legacy of love, hard work, and community." The most impactful moment came when Clarence's lawyer presented the grandmother's letter and the documents proving the legality of the adoption and the farm inheritance. Anthony's face visibly paled, his entire legal basis crumbling before his eyes. Finally, the moment for the sentence arrived. The judge, an older man with wise eyes, looked at both parties before speaking. "This case goes beyond the law," he began. "It's a family tragedy, a story of misunderstood love and resentment that has poisoned lives for decades." The judge found Anthony guilty on all charges, sentencing him to prison and ordering him to pay substantial compensation to Clarence. But what followed surprised everyone in the room. "However," the judge continued, "I see before me two brothers torn apart by years of misunderstandings and pain. Mr. Anthony, as part of your sentence, you will be ordered to undergo therapy and counseling. And to you, Mr. Clarence, I suggest considering forgiveness, not for your brother's sake, but for your own." A murmur ran through the room. David looked at his grandfather, expecting to see anger or resentment. Instead, he saw tears in Clarence's eyes and an expression of deep sadness. When the judge ended the session, Clarence asked for a moment to speak. With David's help, he approached Anthony. "Brother," Clarence said, his voice soft but firm, "what you did was wrong, and you'll have to pay for it. But I want you to know that I forgive you. Not for what you did, but because carrying this hatred has hurt us both for too long." Anthony, for the first time, seemed truly moved. His eyes, usually hard, softened. "Clarence, I'm sorry. I truly am sorry." As the guards took Anthony away, David noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. It wasn't the happy ending of a fairy tale, but it was the beginning of something new, an opportunity to heal deep, old wounds. That night, back at the farm, David and Clarence sat on the porch, gazing at the stars. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" David asked, concerned about the emotional weight of the day. Clarence smiled softly. "Yes, my boy. For the first time in many years, I feel like I can breathe freely. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it gives us the strength to build a better future." As the night progressed, grandfather and grandson remained silent, each lost in their thoughts, but united by a stronger bond than ever. The farm, a silent witness to so many struggles and joys, seemed to glow under the moonlight, as if it too felt that a new era was beginning. The months that followed the trial brought with them a sense of renewal that spread throughout the farm. The air seemed lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the very land itself. David, who had decided to stay permanently on the farm, immersed himself in the work of restoration and modernization. With the compensation received from Anthony and the support of the community, they began to implement new sustainable agricultural techniques, balancing tradition with innovation. Clarence, although still in his wheelchair, seemed rejuvenated. He spent his days sharing his vast experience with David and the workers, his laughter echoing across the fields in a way that hadn't been heard in years. One sunny morning, as David was reviewing some reports on the porch, the sound of an approaching car caught his attention. To his surprise, he saw a young woman get out with a baby in her arms. "David," she called, approaching with a shy smile. "I'm Lucy, your ex-girlfriend. I have something important to tell you." David's heart skipped a beat. Lucy, his youthful love, whom he hadn't seen in over a year, and in her arms. "This is Connor," Lucy said softly. "Your son." The world seemed to stop for a moment. David looked at the little one, immediately noticing his own eyes reflected in the baby's face. I didn't know," David stammered, a mix of emotions overwhelming him. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Lucy lowered her gaze. "I was afraid, David. When we broke up, I didn't know how to handle the situation. But now I think Connor deserves to know his father." At that moment, Clarence appeared at the door, his face lighting up at the sight of the baby. "And who is this little visitor?" he asked with a smile. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of explanations, tears, and finally laughter. Clarence, far from judging, welcomed Lucy and little Connor with open arms. "Life always finds a way to surprise us, my boy," Clarence said to David that night, as they watched Connor sleep in a makeshift crib, sometimes with challenges, and other times with unexpected blessings. The following days were an adjustment for everyone. David, who had been so focused on the farm and taking care of his grandfather, now found himself learning to be a father. Lucy, initially unsure, found unexpected support in Clarence, listening attentively to his stories and advice on parenting. The farm, which once seemed too big and empty, now bustled with new life. Connor's cries mingled with the singing of birds, and his first wobbly steps left imprints on the earth that so many generations had walked before. One afternoon, as David was working in the field, he saw Clarence sitting under a tree, with Connor on his lap. The old man was pointing out different parts of the farm, speaking softly to the child who barely understood, but who listened attentively. "You see, my little one," Clarence was saying, his voice carried by the breeze. "This land has many stories. Stories of pain, yes, but also of love, forgiveness, and new beginnings, and now you are part of that story." David approached, sitting down next to them. "Grandpa, did you ever imagine things would end up like this?" Clarence smiled, his eyes bright. "Life rarely goes as we plan it, David, but sometimes it surprises us with something even better than we could have dreamed." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in oranges and pinks, the three generations remained seated under the tree. The farm, which had witnessed so many struggles and joys, seemed to vibrate with a new energy. David looked around, at the fields that now bloomed with new crops, at the house that was gradually filling with laughter and new memories, and at his small family gathered together. He understood that the true inheritance of the farm wasn't in the land or the legal documents, but in the love and connections forged here. "You were right, Grandpa," David said softly. "This is better than anything I could have imagined." And as Connor laughed, reaching for a butterfly fluttering nearby, David knew that this wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of an exciting new chapter. 3 years had passed since that day when Lucy appeared with little Connor in her arms. The farm, once on the brink of collapse, now flourished under David's dedicated care and Clarence's wisdom. The fields were green with thriving crops, and the sound of Connor's laughter, now a lively 4-year-old, filled the air. One sunny morning, as David was checking the mail at the entrance of the house, an official letter caught his attention. With trembling hands, he opened it and read its contents. His face paled. "Grandpa," David called, hurrying into the house. "It's about Uncle Anthony. They're going to release him next week." Clarence, sitting in his chair by the window, slowly closed the book he was reading. His face, marked by the years but still full of vitality, showed a mixture of emotions. "It was to be expected, my boy," Clarence said softly. "Time passes for everyone, even in prison." The following days were tense. David found himself constantly looking towards the driveway, expecting to see Anthony's car at any moment. Lucy, who now lived permanently on the farm with David and Connor, noticed the concern in her partner's eyes. "What will we do if he comes here?" Lucy asked one night as they were putting Connor to bed. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, part of me wants to forbid him from entering, to protect our family, but another part knows that forgiveness is a two-way street," Clarence completed, having entered the room silently. "The forgiveness I offered in the courtroom wasn't just for Anthony, it was for all of us." A week after Anthony's release, The sound of an approaching car alerted everyone on the farm. David went out to the porch, his heart pounding. An unfamiliar vehicle stopped, and Anthony and his two sons got out. Time in prison had changed Anthony. His hair, once black, was now completely grey. His shoulders, once proudly erect, were now slightly hunched. But what surprised David most was the expression in his eyes. There was no longer anger or resentment, only a deep sadness and perhaps a glimmer of hope. "David," Anthony greeted, his voice hoarse, we wanted to talk to Clarence and to you." David hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, stepping aside to let them enter. Clarence was waiting for them in the living room, Lucy standing protectively by his side, with Connor hiding behind her legs. The silence that followed was tense, laden with years of pain and regret. Finally, Anthony spoke, his voice breaking. "Brother," he said, looking at Clarence, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did, there's no excuse. But these years in prison have made me see things differently. I've understood the harm I caused, not just to you, but to our entire family." Clarence listened in silence, his eyes fixed on his adoptive brother. Anthony continued, tears running down his cheeks. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were before. I know that's impossible. But if you'd give me the chance to prove that I've changed, to be part of this family in some way." Anthony's sons, both with expressions of shame and regret, nodded in agreement with their father's words. David looked at his grandfather, waiting for his reaction. Clarence closed his eyes for a moment, as if searching for the answer in the depths of his heart. When he opened them, there was a mixture of caution and compassion in his gaze. "Anthony," Clarence began, his voice firm but kind, "the forgiveness I offered you in the courtroom still stands. But trust is something you'll have to earn again, day by day." Then Clarence looked at David and Lucy. "This is no longer just my decision. We have a family to protect, a future to build." David stepped forward, taking Lucy's hand. "Uncle Anthony, it won't be easy. There are wounds that will take time to heal. But if you've truly changed, if you're willing to work for it, maybe we can find a way forward. Together." At that moment, Connor, who had been observing everything with childish curiosity, approached Anthony. "Are you my great-uncle?" he asked innocently. Anthony, surprised, knelt down to be at the child's level. "Yes, little one, I'm your great-uncle. Do you want to see my toys?" Connor offered, with the simplicity and openness that only a child can have. That simple question seemed to break the tension in the room. Tears welled up in Anthony's eyes, and for the first time in decades, a genuine smile lit up his face. As Connor led Anthony and his cousins to see his toys, David, Lucy, and Clarence exchanged glances. They knew that the path to true reconciliation would be long and difficult. There would be moments of doubt, painful memories, and challenges. But in that instant, seeing 3 generations interact, they felt a ray of hope. The farm, which had witnessed so much pain, could now be the setting for a new story, one of forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of a new beginning. Time, as always, continued its relentless course. 5 years had passed since Anthony's return, and the farm had witnessed profound changes, not only in its fields and structures, but in the hearts of those who inhabited it. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, and the old house was full of life and laughter. The family had gathered to celebrate Clarence's 90th birthday. The backyard was decorated with colorful garlands, and the aroma of barbecue mingled with the scent of wildflowers. David, now with some premature grey at his temples, observed the scene with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Connor, 9 years old, played happily with his cousins, Anthony's grandchildren, as if the conflicts of the past had never existed. Lucy, with a baby in her arms, little Clara, the latest addition to the family, chatted animatedly with Anthony's sons' wives. And there, at the center of it all, was Clarence. Although time had curved his back even more, and his hands trembled slightly, his eyes shone with an unbreakable vitality. Beside him, Anthony, now completely grey-haired, listened attentively to his adoptive brother's stories. The path to reconciliation had not been easy. There had been moments of tension, doubts, and old painful memories that threatened to resurface. But with patience, Understanding and above all with Clarence's unconditional love, the family had found a new balance. Anthony, true to his word, had worked tirelessly to prove his change. He began by helping with the humblest tasks on the farm, gradually earning the trust of the workers and the community. Over time, his business experience proved to be a valuable asset, helping David expand the farm's operations sustainably. David approached his grandfather, offering him a glass of water. "How do you feel, Grandpa?" Clarence smiled, his eyes scanning the yard full of family and friends. "I feel blessed, my boy. Look around you. This is the true wealth we have harvested." At that moment, Connor came running up, followed by his cousins. "Great-grandpa, tell us again the story of how you came to America." The children sat around Clarence, their eyes bright with anticipation. Clarence began his tale, his voice soft but clear, transporting everyone to a distant time of challenges and hopes. As the afternoon progressed, David noticed Anthony stepping away from the group a bit, his gaze lost in the farm fields. He approached him, offering him a cup of coffee. "Everything okay, Uncle?" Anthony nodded slowly. "You know, David, I spent much of my life coveting this land, believing it would give me the power and respect I thought I deserved. How foolish I was. The true wealth was here all along in the family, in the love that Clarence never stopped offering, even when I didn't deserve it." David put a hand on his uncle's shoulder. "The past is past, Uncle. What matters is the now and the future we're building together." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in oranges and pinks, the family gathered for the birthday photo. Clarence, in the center, held little Clara in his arms. Around him, 3 generations crowded together, smiling. David and Lucy, Anthony and his sons with their families, farm workers who had become part of the extended family, and in the front row, Connor and his cousins, the future of the farm. As the photographer prepared, Clarence looked around, his eyes moist with emotion. "Family," he said, his voice laden with love. "This is our true legacy. Not the land, not the money, but the love that unites us. Nurture it, cultivate it, and you'll see that there's no more abundant harvest." The camera flash captured that moment, immortalizing not only the smiles and faces, but also the essence of what the farm had become, a symbol of forgiveness, second chances, and the transformative power of unconditional love. That night, when the guests had left and the house fell silent, David helped Clarence prepare for bed. As he tucked him in, Clarence took his grandson's hand. "David, my boy, do you remember when you came here years ago worried about me and the farm?" David nodded, remembering those days of uncertainty and fear. "Look how much we've grown since then," Clarence continued. "Not just the land, but our hearts. This farm has witnessed pain, yes, but also healing and love. Promise me you'll continue to cultivate that love, that you'll teach Connor and Clara that forgiveness and compassion are the most valuable seeds we can plant." With tears in his eyes, David kissed his grandfather's forehead. "I promise, Grandpa, your legacy will live on in every corner of this land and in each one of us." As Clarence fell asleep, David went out to the porch. The night was clear, the sky full of stars. He breathed deeply, feeling the connection with the earth beneath his feet, with the history that ran through his veins, and with the future that stretched out before him. The farm, which had once been on the brink of ruin, was now more alive than ever. Not just because of its thriving crops or economic success, but because of the love that had blossomed on its soil, a love capable of overcoming hatred, of healing deep wounds, and of uniting a family that had once been fractured. David smiled, looking towards the house where his family slept peacefully. He knew they would face challenges in the future, that there would be difficult days. But he also knew that rooted in the love and wisdom that Clarence had taught them, they could face anything, together. And so under the starry mantle of the Virginia night, the farm rested, guarding in its soil the secrets of the past, the joys of the present, and the promises of a future full of hope.